The idea of love in the Middle Ages is often dressed in the velvet colors of romance, with troubadours singing under balconies and noble knights swearing eternal devotion. But behind the songs and idealized verses, the reality of how affection was expressed was far less poetic. In truth, even something as intimate as a love letter could not escape the rigid structures of control, power, and reputation. A man rarely sat at a desk and poured his heart out to the woman he desired. Instead, words of passion were dictated, translated, or disguised through the hand of another. Third parties, from trusted clerics to professional scribes, became the invisible voices of lovers who dared not risk exposure. This was not merely a quirk of etiquette, but a necessity born of a society where every interaction was monitored and every whisper of desire could stain a family's honor. Subscribe to the channel before the church bell rings and ruins your focus. And by the way, what time is it where you are? I already lost track completely. Imagine a young noblewoman receiving a letter sealed in wax, the lines filled with declarations of admiration and longing. She knows it was not penned by the trembling hand of her admirer, but by a scribe who had carefully crafted every phrase. Between the words lies both tenderness and distance. The emotion belongs to one man, the ink to another. This strange detachment shows how even the most private gesture of affection had to pass through a filter, stripping it of intimacy, yet ensuring it could exist at all. What was meant to be a whisper between two hearts had to become a performance for the eyes of guardians, families, and sometimes even courts. The letter was both a confession and a shield. Such letters often carried a double meaning. A phrase about the warmth of sunlight on one's face could hide a bolder desire, recognizable only to the recipient. Codes and metaphors became essential tools in a time when straightforward passion might be deemed dangerous. In some cases, entire letters were written in Latin not to sound scholarly, but to create a barrier of secrecy, since not every household member would be able to decipher them. The result was a web of words where love had to disguise itself as philosophy, theology, or moral teaching, masking the true heat beneath layers of formality. This gave the written exchange a kind of game-like quality. To understand the hidden flame, one had to read between the lines to hear the heartbeat muffled by ink. Even the act of delivering the letter carried its own risks and rituals. Trusted servants or younger siblings were pressed into service as messengers. Their loyalty could mean the difference between a budding romance and a scandal that might ruin entire families. A misplaced parchment, a prying eye, or a loose tongue could transform secret admiration into open shame. History preserves accounts of letters intercepted and read aloud in courts, used as evidence of impropriety or as leverage in political negotiations. A lover's most vulnerable expression could, in a moment, be twisted into a weapon. The very paper meant to carry tenderness might instead carry destruction. Yet, the danger of discovery only heightened the thrill. Lovers knew that behind every word there was risk, and this risk was intoxicating. The forbidden added intensity. A carefully phrased compliment about the embroidery on a sleeve was not merely about cloth, but about touching what could not be touched. The beauty of such exchanges lay in their restraint. Desire was carved into the silences, into what was left unsaid, forcing imagination to fill in the spaces between lines. The absence of physical closeness demanded creativity, and creativity often bred stronger bonds than mere proximity could achieve. In a paradoxical way, the barriers themselves became the fuel for deeper longing. But this system of mediated letters also revealed the power dynamics at play. A wealthy nobleman could afford a skilled scribe to shape his affections into eloquent poetry, while a less fortunate suitor might struggle to find even a literate friend willing to take the risk. Love, therefore, was not only about hearts, but about resources, access, and networks. Those without connections could be silenced before their voices ever reached the beloved. The supposed intimacy of a letter was a privilege of rank, turning even romance into another arena of inequality. In this sense, medieval letters were not just symbols of affection, but also mirrors of society itself, reflecting who held power and who was denied it. We must also remember that some of these letters were not spontaneous outpourings, but carefully calculated moves in the larger chessboard of marriage and alliance. A father might commission flattering words to woo a powerful family into agreement. A mother might orchestrate the exchange to test the suitability of a suitor. The young lovers often became actors in a script written by their elders, their emotions secondary to the negotiation of land, titles, or military support. What looked like passion could often be politics in disguise. Behind the wax seals and flowing words lay the heavy hand of family strategy. And yet, within this rigid framework, genuine feeling still managed to breathe. There are accounts of letters where passion broke through, where the scribe's careful hand could not entirely hide the urgency dictated to him. Scholars have found marginal notes, hidden signatures, or deliberately misspelled words that acted as secret marks of authenticity. These small acts of rebellion remind us that even in the tight grip of societal control, the human heart fought for expression. It was a delicate battle where the ink of longing had to outmaneuver the ink of duty. The paradox of medieval love letters is that they were at once the most personal and the least personal of exchanges. They carried the essence of longing but filtered it through layers of caution, strategy, and control. To read them today is to sense the tension between what was felt and what was allowed, between passion and propriety. Every line tells two stories, one of devotion and one of surveillance. This duality defined not just the letters themselves, but the entire culture of courtship in the Middle Ages. And as we picture these carefully folded messages, passed from hand to hand under the watchful eyes of family and church, we begin to understand that love itself was never just about two people. It was about everyone who stood between them, everyone who could bless or destroy the bond with a single word. The letter was only the beginning, the fragile spark of a connection that would have to survive an even harsher reality beyond parchment and ink. In the medieval world, even when words were finally exchanged through letters, the true test of love came in person. But in person did not mean what we might imagine today. There was no quiet dinner for two, no walk hand in hand at dusk, no unguarded intimacy. Meetings were carefully orchestrated performances, staged under the scrutiny of others. A young man hoping to see his beloved would find her only in the presence of her family, perhaps in a hall lit by torches where every gesture could be observed. Privacy was considered dangerous, even scandalous, because it opened the door to temptation, rumor, and dishonor. And so love was forced to exist in a paradox. To grow, it needed presence, but the presence was always shadowed by watchful eyes. Picture a young woman seated in her father's great hall, her mother and sisters spinning wool beside her. The suitor enters, bows with formality, and takes his place not across a table, but across a battlefield of social expectation. Every glance he casts is measured, every word he speaks recorded silently by those who sit nearby. He cannot whisper his devotion. He must disguise it in compliments about her skill with embroidery, her talent at managing household affairs, or her grace in conversation. It is a dance of words, where affection hides in plain sight, cloaked in etiquette, so that outsiders hear only courtesy, while the intended recipient understands the deeper layer. Supervision was not only about propriety, but also about power. A father or elder brother stood as the gatekeeper, ensuring that the suitor was worthy and that no inappropriate bond was forming. Mothers, too, played their part, often acting as both guardians and interpreters of the encounter. They could guide their daughters with subtle looks, approving or disapproving of what was unfolding before them. It was as if every meeting was not simply a dialogue between two young hearts, but a negotiation involving an entire household, where the reputation of generations hung in the balance. The lovers' voices were just one part of a much larger chorus, but even under such scrutiny, lovers learned to bend the rules of surveillance. A fleeting glance across the room, a hand that brushed against fabric under the guise of passing an object, or a phrase that seemed innocent to others but dripped with hidden meaning, these became the true language of medieval courtship. Every moment carried the thrill of secrecy within the glare of visibility. It was as though the presence of chaperones forced creativity, sharpening the wits of young lovers to find expression where none seemed possible. What could not be said aloud lived in the tilt of a head, the pause before a smile, or the lingering of a hand over a goblet. This atmosphere created enormous pressure, but it also heightened the stakes. A mistake could be catastrophic. A whisper caught by the wrong ear could spark gossip that spread faster than fire through straw-roofed houses. Entire reputations could crumble because of one misstep, and reputations in medieval society were worth more than gold. To be accused of impropriety meant not only personal shame, but the possibility of ruining marriage prospects, damaging alliances, and dragging entire families into disgrace. Thus, the young lovers balanced their desire for closeness with the heavy weight of caution, knowing that one careless moment might destroy everything they longed for. At the same time, there was an irony woven into these guarded meetings. While families feared the dangers of intimacy, the very act of forcing constant supervision often produced the opposite effect. Desire thrives in limitation, and when every gesture is forbidden, even the smallest act takes on enormous significance. A smile exchanged across a crowded hall could feel as intoxicating as a stolen kiss. The inability to be alone together created a world where imagination filled the gaps, where the heart clung fiercely to fragments because those fragments were all it was allowed. Love became both more fragile and more intense precisely because it was so tightly contained. This system of supervised encounters also revealed how differently men and women navigated affection. A young man might try to impress not only the woman, but her entire family, displaying his manners, his courage, his knowledge of scripture, or his skill in conversation. Meanwhile, a young woman was expected to embody both grace and modesty, never appearing too eager, never betraying too much emotion, lest she be judged as frivolous or dishonorable. The expectations were uneven, but both sides felt the pressure of being watched, judged, and weighed in every movement. Courtship was as much a test of endurance as of emotion, and beyond the hall or chamber encounters could also take place during public festivities, banquets, religious processions, or village fairs. Even in these settings, eyes were everywhere. Families monitored interactions as though they were scouting the battlefield of alliances, and neighbors whispered judgments that might echo for years. Yet these public gatherings offered rare opportunities for lovers to be in one another's presence, even if separated by a dozen bodies in a procession or sitting across from each other at a crowded feast. To outsiders, it might look ordinary, but to those two hearts, the event was electric. One shared glance in the chaos could become a memory cherished for months. What fascinates us about these meetings is how they turned the ordinary into the extraordinary. A simple exchange of words that today would mean nothing, "Will you pass the bread?" could carry layers of meaning when spoken under the eyes of chaperones. A question so mundane became a declaration, a secret shared between two people who were forbidden from saying anything more. The entire weight of affection had to be squeezed into fragments of conversation, a smile concealed as courtesy, a sigh disguised as politeness. For those who lived it, these moments were unforgettable because they were so precarious, always balanced on the edge of discovery. And this balance is what defined love in the medieval age. It was never simply about passion between two people, but about how that passion navigated the structures built around it. Every meeting was an ordeal, every glance a rebellion, every word a risk. Yet in that risk lay the sweetness that lovers cherished. The very restrictions that threatened to suffocate them also made each exchange priceless. To live under constant watch and still find ways to express affection was not just romance, it was survival. And in that survival, love proved itself capable of enduring the most suffocating of cages. Promises of marriage in the medieval world were not light-hearted affairs whispered in private. They carried the weight of law, family honor, and social stability. A single vow spoken in earnest could become binding in the eyes of the church and community, even without a ceremony or a written contract. The very act of declaring, "I promise to marry you," in front of witnesses, was often enough to create an obligation as powerful as a signed document. These promises transformed affection into currency, capable of buying trust, forging alliances, and sometimes even triggering violent disputes when broken. Love was not free, it was negotiated, bargained, and frequently traded as if it were property. Imagine a young nobleman desperate to secure the hand of a woman whose dowry would elevate his family's status. He swears before her parents and two neighbors that he will wed her. That promise, simple in words, becomes binding by the customs of the age. Months later, if his family changes course and seeks a more profitable union, the broken pledge might erupt into scandal. The woman's family could accuse him of dishonor, dragging his name through courts and before the clergy. For her, the broken promise could mean ruin, since being considered betrothed once made her less desirable in the eyes of other suitors. What began as an intimate vow quickly became a public battlefield where emotion clashed with reputation and law. It was common for promises to be made under pressure, sometimes even extracted from lovers in moments of passion. A whispered vow by candlelight, witnessed accidentally by a servant or relative, might later be used as evidence in disputes. The church often sided with these testimonies, declaring that the couple was, in fact, married by their own words, even if no priest or altar had been involved. This led to countless conflicts where men tried to deny promises made in secret, while women fought desperately to have those promises recognized to secure their status and protect their future. In many ways, a medieval vow was more dangerous than silence because, once spoken, it could trap both parties in a fate neither had fully considered. Promises were also political weapons. Kings and lords arranged them to seal alliances long before the young bride and groom were old enough to understand the meaning of the words. Betrothals were often agreed upon when children were still in the cradle, used as bargaining chips in negotiations over land, military support, or peace treaties. A child's future could be sealed with a handshake between two powerful men, reducing the concept of love to a pawn in a game of dynastic survival. These agreements, while strategic, also placed enormous strain on individuals who grew up knowing that their personal choices had already been stripped away in infancy. Their lives became performances of promises they never made, yet were bound to honor. The seriousness of such pledges explains why annulments and broken engagements were treated with such intensity. To break a promise of marriage was to break not only a personal bond, but a sacred and legal one. Chronicles tell of families clashing violently, duels fought to defend honor, and villages split into factions because one suitor failed to honor his word. The personal and the political were inseparable, and so every promise carried the echo of war as much as the hope of union. Marriage was not just about two hearts. It was about two houses, two lineages, and often two armies. But amid this climate of formality and danger, there were still moments of genuine passion hidden within these vows. Some promises were made, not for politics, but in stolen hours, whispered with trembling sincerity by two lovers who truly longed for one another. In these rare cases, the words had a sacredness that transcended the legal and the political. Couples who managed to hold on to such vows often defied enormous opposition, clinging to the purity of their promise as their only weapon against the crushing weight of family and society. The church might have seen these vows as binding, but for the lovers themselves, they were lifeline, proof that amidst the cold machinery of arranged unions, love could still carve out a space to breathe. Yet even these heartfelt promises came with risks. There are stories of young women who insisted they were already married because of a private vow, only to be dismissed, shamed, or punished. Others found themselves accused of lying, their reputations destroyed while their lovers walked free. The imbalance of power between men and women meant that promises were often tools used against the very people who believed in them most deeply. For women, a broken vow could mean social death. For men, it was an inconvenience to be negotiated. This cruel disparity reveals the darker side of medieval romance, that love's words, once spoken, could become shackles instead of wings. The paradox of the medieval promise is that it elevated words into sacred truth, yet often stripped them of genuine meaning. Families treated vows as contracts. The church treated them as sacraments, and communities treated them as binding law. But for the individuals caught in the middle, promises could be both salvation and prison. They gave hope to those who longed for each other, but also sealed the fates of those who wished to escape. Every word carried the weight of destiny, leaving little room for doubt or change of heart. In this world, the simple act of saying, "I will marry you," could set in motion events that determined the future of entire lineages. It was a reminder that love was never merely private. It was public property, monitored, negotiated, and weaponized. And as vows grew heavier, laden with both hope and danger, lovers were forced to navigate the treacherous line between sincerity and survival, knowing that their fate could rest on a single spoken word. Gifts in the Middle Ages were never just tokens of affection. They were symbols layered with meaning, obligations, and coded messages that only the initiated could fully understand. To give a gift was to speak without words, to cross boundaries that language could not safely navigate in a world where romance was monitored, restricted, and often treated as dangerous. A glove, a ribbon, a piece of embroidery, even a feather from a hawk could carry more weight than 1,000 whispered promises. They were tangible anchors of devotion in a culture where direct intimacy was nearly impossible, and every object carried both risk and power. Consider the glove, one of the most common love tokens of the time. To receive a glove from a suitor was not simply to acquire an accessory, it was to be handed a fragment of their very presence. Gloves protected hands, the instruments of labor, touch, and combat. To exchange them was to say, silently, "My hand is yours, even when I cannot give it openly." A young woman might sleep with a glove tucked beneath her pillow, clinging to it as though it were the hand of her beloved, while a knight might tie his lady's glove to his armor before riding into battle. The object became more than cloth and stitching. It became a stand-in for the body itself, a fragment of intimacy disguised as something practical. Jewelry also carried its own peculiar symbolism. Rings, for example, were not only valuable for the metal and stones they bore, but for their circular shape, which symbolized eternity. Yet rings were not always diamonds or gold. Sometimes they were simple bands of twisted thread or carved bone, tokens small enough to be exchanged without drawing suspicion. Some women would braid their own hair into rings or bracelets for their lovers, a raw and intimate gesture that gave a piece of themselves quite literally into the hands of another. To wear such an item was to carry their presence constantly, even in the harshest environments of court or battlefield. These gifts whispered of loyalty and permanence in ways words could never safely achieve. But not all gifts were so conventional. Historical records speak of far stranger offerings, each tied to the eccentricities of medieval symbolism. Birds, for instance, were prized not only for their beauty, but for the meanings attached to them. A falcon's feather symbolized power and dominance, while a dove might represent purity and devotion. In some romances, lovers sent each other small live animals, such as dogs or songbirds, which were both companions and metaphors for fidelity. To care for such a gift was to demonstrate commitment, turning the act of feeding and nurturing into a living reminder of the bond. The more unusual the gift, the more deeply personal its meaning became, even when others could not fully understand it. These exchanges, however, were not without danger. A discovered token could unravel secrets faster than words ever could. A ribbon found in the wrong hands might expose a clandestine love affair. A servant carrying a gift could betray it to suspicious parents. Even the act of accepting or refusing an item was fraught with meaning. To accept was to acknowledge a bond. To refuse was to reject not just the gift, but the giver. This high-stakes game made every object a potential scandal, and yet the very risk amplified their importance. Lovers clung to these tangible symbols because they were all they had to bridge the chasm of distance, supervision, and silence. Sometimes, these tokens crossed into the realm of the sacred. Relics, pieces of fabric touched to saints' shrines, or even small fragments of bone became gifts between lovers, blending the language of faith with the language of desire. A knight might carry a holy relic gifted by his beloved into battle, believing it protected him not only by divine grace, but also by the power of her devotion. In this way, gifts became bridges between heaven and earth, layering spiritual meaning onto personal affection. The blending of love and religion created a complexity that made these tokens all the more potent, because they operated in two worlds at once. The darker side of these exchanges lay in how easily gifts could be weaponized. What began as a gesture of love could later become evidence in court, used to prove promises of marriage or secret liaisons. Families eager to control narratives might parade these objects before priests and judges, twisting symbols of devotion into tools of accusation. For women especially, the discovery of such tokens could spell disaster, their reputations shattered by proof of intimacy that society deemed inappropriate. The very objects meant to safeguard affection could become instruments of betrayal. And yet, despite this danger, the practice continued, a testament to how deeply people longed to leave traces of themselves in the lives of those they loved. Even literature of the period reflects the fascination with gifts. Troubadour songs and courtly romances are filled with stories of knights treasuring their lady's ribbon, or maidens cherishing a knight's cloak clasp. These details were not mere embellishments, but reflections of real cultural practices. They reveal how objects could become extensions of the body, carrying warmth, scent, and memory across distances and through dangers. To read these tales is to see how medieval people transformed the ordinary into extraordinary, making even the simplest token into a vessel of longing. And it is precisely this transformation that reveals the essence of medieval courtship. Love could not be shouted, displayed, or openly lived. It had to be smuggled into the folds of daily life, hidden in fabric, wood, feathers, or strands of hair. Each gift was both a confession and a disguise, both a risk and a refuge. In their secrecy lay their beauty, for they allowed love to survive in an environment designed to suffocate it. What mattered was not the object itself, but the invisible weight it carried, the story it told, and the emotions it dared to hold in silence. The strangeness and intensity of these tokens remind us that medieval love was not free-floating sentiment, but a battlefield of symbols. Every exchange was a gamble, every object a declaration that risked exposure and ruin. Yet lovers still gave, still risked, still sought to press fragments of themselves into the hands of those they cherished. In the absence of freedom, they built a world of meaning from objects, turning the mundane into the miraculous. And in those fragile offerings, love found a way to speak, even when every voice was silenced. Romance in the Middle Ages often began as a whisper of hope, but ended as a carefully executed calculation. For many, what started with glances, letters, and secret tokens soon became tangled in the machinery of political necessity. The line between love and strategy blurred until, more often than not, one was sacrificed for the other. Families did not look at affection as the foundation of a marriage. They looked at land, titles, armies, and alliances. A father cared less about whether his daughter's heart quickened in the presence of a suitor, and more about whether her hand would secure borders or bring wealth. In this world, love was a luxury, while political advantage was survival. Imagine a young woman who had spent months exchanging veiled words and gifts with a man she truly admired. She dreamed of a life by his side, whispered prayers that their bond might flourish, and held his ribbon against her heart at night. And yet, when negotiations began, her family announced she was promised to another, a man decades older, chosen not for charm or devotion, but for the lands he controlled and the soldiers he could provide. Her desires dissolved in an instant, replaced by obligation. What had once been an unfolding love story was abruptly rewritten into a treaty between households. Such stories were not rare, but routine, each one reminding us that in the medieval world, marriage was less about joining two hearts and more about binding two dynasties. This practice was particularly brutal among the nobility, where marriage was a tool wielded like a sword. Kings arranged unions not out of tenderness, but to secure peace or claim territories. Queens were married off as pawns to cement treaties or to pacify rival factions. Princes and princesses became bargaining chips in games of power that spanned continents. The grandeur of weddings, banquets, jewels, and processions was not meant to celebrate love, but to display wealth and dominance, broadcasting to all that the alliance had been successfully sealed. Love, if it ever arrived, was expected to grow later, if at all, and more often than not, it never did. The cruelty of these arrangements becomes clearer when we consider how little choice individuals had. A young man might be forced into marriage with a woman he barely knew, his personal feelings irrelevant compared to his family's need for influence. A young woman might be sent across the sea to wed a stranger in a foreign court, carrying only her dowry and the expectation of obedience. Their personal happiness was not even a question worth asking. Duty outweighed affection, and obedience was considered virtue, what modern audiences would view as tragic sacrifice. Medieval society praised as loyalty to family and faith. There were, however, moments when romance and politics collided in unexpected ways. A well-placed love could sometimes influence a strategy, rather than be crushed by it. There are accounts of noblemen refusing political matches in favor of the women they adored, sparking scandal and even war. These rare rebellions captured the imagination of contemporaries, who turned them into stories of legendary devotion. Yet, even when love triumphed, the victory was fragile, often leaving behind fractured alliances or bitter enmities. Love could win a battle, but it rarely won the war against the structures that ruled medieval life. Even within these forced unions, not all was cold calculation. Some couples grew to respect, even to care for one another, discovering companionship over time. Shared duties, shared children, and shared survival could knit together bonds that began without passion. Yet this slow growth of affection was uncertain, and many marriages remained empty, their participants locked in lives that served everyone but themselves. The presence of troubadour songs and romantic literature during this time is telling. People longed for a vision of love that reality seldom provided. They clung to stories of knights and ladies who defied the odds precisely because their own lives rarely allowed such freedom. It is worth noting that political marriages were not limited to the highest ranks. Even among merchants and peasants, practical concerns often outweighed emotion. A farmer might marry his daughter to a man with better land, ensuring survival for both families. A merchant might seek a union that expanded trade networks. The language was different, but the principle was the same. The survival of the group came before the happiness of the individual. Love was seen as fragile, unreliable, and even dangerous, while alliances were considered steady and essential. The echoes of this mindset are still felt today, where families in certain cultures arrange unions with the same pragmatic intent. What makes this tension so compelling is the way it exposes the human heart's resilience. Even within arrangements designed to smother passion, love found ways to breathe. Servants carried secret messages between unwilling brides and their true lovers. Noble women found confidants among ladies-in-waiting who helped them conceal their desires. Knights risked disgrace to remain faithful to vows spoken in private, even as they stood beside wives chosen for them by kings. The clash between duty and desire was not simply a historical reality. It was the very essence of medieval romance, fueling both tragedy and legend. And yet, the shadow of politics always loomed. Every union, every betrayal, every whispered vow had consequences that rippled far beyond two people. A broken promise could start a feud. A refused marriage could spark war. A forbidden love could bring down an entire household. In such a world, romance was not only fragile but perilous. To love truly was to defy not just parents or lords, but the very system that held society together. The weight of this risk infused medieval romance with a sharpness and intensity that few eras have matched. In the end, most romances that began with youthful passion were absorbed into the machinery of arranged marriage. The songs of troubadours reminded listeners of what could have been, while reality forced men and women into roles dictated by survival and strategy. The tragedy of this contrast is what makes medieval love so haunting. It was not that people lacked passion, they had it in abundance, but that the world around them rarely allowed it to shape their destinies. And this harsh truth prepared the stage for the final revelation, that for many there was almost no space left for true, unguarded, spontaneous love. The medieval world was a place where passion had to fight for every breath, and nowhere was this struggle more visible than in the space left for true, spontaneous love. It was a narrow and treacherous path, squeezed between family expectations, political alliances, religious restrictions, and the relentless gaze of a community that judged every step. Love, as we understand it today, private, personal, and freely chosen, was often seen as reckless indulgence. Marriage was a contract, not a celebration of affection. Yet the human heart does not bend easily to systems. And because of this, the rare cases where love broke through shine all the brighter, glowing like embers in the darkness of duty. To fall in love without permission was dangerous. It meant disregarding the carefully constructed walls erected by family and church. A noble woman who chose affection over arrangement risked not only her reputation, but her life. Chronicles tell of women locked away in convents for loving the wrong man, stripped of worldly ties to erase their disobedience. Men who refused political marriages in favor of love could be disinherited, cast out, or even targeted in feuds that escalated into violence. And yet, the risk itself became part of the allure. The forbidden always tastes sweeter, and for medieval lovers, each stolen moment carried a weight that made it unforgettable. This is why clandestine meetings were so treasured. A glance across a hall, a whispered word exchanged in the shadows of a church, a hand brushed quickly beneath the cover of a cloak. These moments were brief, but they became lifelines. When everything conspired to keep lovers apart, the smallest touch felt monumental. These fragments of connection reveal a truth that resonates even now. The less freedom people have to express love, the more they treasure the fragments they can steal. Love in the Middle Ages was not always about grand gestures. It was about survival in the cracks of a system that worked against it. Troubadours and poets immortalized this tension through the tradition of courtly love, a stylized form of romance that elevated longing above fulfillment. Songs told of knights who adored ladies they could never truly possess, of passions doomed by birth, duty, or distance. The beauty of the love story lay not in its happy ending, but in its persistence against impossibility. These tales were not fantasies disconnected from reality. They were reflections of a society where unfulfilled desire was the rule, not the exception. Audiences clung to them because they mirrored their own secret frustrations, their own yearning for a love that could exist beyond contracts and treaties. What is striking is how these ideals sometimes spilled into reality. Knights pledged themselves to unattainable women, wearing their tokens into battle not because they expected marriage, but because the symbol itself gave meaning to their struggle. Ladies encouraged such devotion, even if it never culminated in union, because it gave them a measure of influence and power within a world that otherwise silenced them. These romances existed in the tension between reality and imagination, giving both men and women a way to experience passion without breaking entirely from the structures that confined them. It was a delicate balance, fragile and thrilling, where love lived as much in the mind as in the heart. Yet even with literature and coded gestures, many found themselves trapped in loveless unions. Marriages arranged for land or dowry might last a lifetime without affection ever taking root. The silence of these homes was its own tragedy, where children grew up watching parents bound together by duty, but separated by indifference. Some sought solace in affairs, risking scandal and even excommunication. Others buried their desires so deeply that they disappeared into obedience. The scarcity of true love stories in historical records is not proof that love did not exist, but evidence of how ruthlessly it was suppressed, hidden, or destroyed. The fact that we still hear whispers of it centuries later is a testament to how powerful those rare sparks must have been. Curiously, love often bloomed most freely among those with the least to lose. Peasants, though bound by their own social obligations, sometimes had greater freedom in choosing spouses compared to nobles, whose lives were dictated by alliances. A farm girl and a village boy could fall in love at a festival and convince their families to approve, provided the match was practical. Their love might not have been celebrated in poems or courts, but it was lived in daily life, in shared labor, in raising children and surviving hardships together. While nobility chased strategy, commoners sometimes managed to find authenticity, even if it was less glamorous. This contrast reminds us that the space for true love, however small, was never entirely erased. The Church's influence further complicated these fragile freedoms. On one hand, it recognized the sanctity of mutual consent, which meant a man and woman who privately exchanged vows could be considered married in the eyes of God. This gave couples some leverage against families that tried to force them apart. On the other hand, the Church was also quick to condemn lust and passion, branding desire itself as sinful. This paradox created confusion. Love could sanctify, but also condemn, liberate, but also imprison. Couples who dared to trust in secret vows often found themselves caught between divine blessing and human punishment, unsure whether they had gained freedom or signed their own ruin. The most haunting aspect of medieval love is its fragility. It could burn brightly for a season only to be extinguished by duty, gossip, or betrayal. Yet even in its fragility, it left echoes powerful enough to survive the centuries. The letters, poems, and stories that remain show us that people yearned as deeply then as we do now, that the hunger for connection is timeless. But their yearning was sharpened by the constant awareness of danger, which gave every emotion a sharper edge. To love in such a world was to gamble everything for something fleeting, knowing the odds were against you, but also knowing that the prize, a moment of genuine, unguarded affection, was worth the risk. In the end, the Middle Ages remind us that love does not need freedom to exist. It needs courage. Even in the narrowest spaces, hemmed in by laws, family, and fear, people found ways to love. They turned glances into language, objects into symbols, and songs into lifelines. They carved out corners of intimacy in a world that tried to erase it. And in those corners, true love survived, not as the rule, but as the exception, a rare and dangerous flame that burned brighter because it was constantly threatened with extinction. The idea of the court of love may sound like a romantic invention. Yet in medieval Europe, it was a phenomenon that blended performance, philosophy, and desire into a structured game. These gatherings, often associated with noble courts in regions such as Aquitaine and Champagne, were spaces where men and women debated the nature of love under the guise of rules, rituals, and judgments. Presided over by noble ladies, sometimes even queens, these courts operated like playful parliaments of passion. They did not decide disputes over land or blood, but over glances, words, and fidelity. For those living in a society dominated by politics and arranged marriages, this was a daring attempt to create a realm where love itself could be weighed, measured, and even defended. Picture a grand hall lit by torches, where noblemen and women sit in a circle not to discuss war or law, but to answer questions such as, can love exist within marriage, or only outside of it? Is a knight more noble if he serves one lady faithfully, or if he seeks the attention of many? These debates were not idle chatter, but carefully argued cases, where poetry, wit, and eloquence were weapons sharper than swords. Women often acted as judges, pronouncing verdicts that would shape the behavior of lovers in their circles. In this way, the court of love offered women an unusual kind of authority, one that contrasted sharply with the restrictions of everyday life. Here, at least for a moment, they could dictate the rules of desire rather than merely obey them. The rules of love that emerged from these settings were sometimes collected and recorded, blending satire with sincerity. Among them were declarations that love must always be secret, that true lovers are consumed by jealousy, that no one can be bound by two loves at once, and that real passion thrives only in difficulty. These rules codified what was already happening in hidden corners of medieval society, that love, forbidden and constrained, was most powerful when it struggled against obstacles. The very limitations that suffocated romance in daily life became celebrated as the essence of true devotion within these playful tribunals. To love easily was to love poorly. To suffer for love was to prove its worth. It is tempting to dismiss these courts as mere entertainment, the diversion of nobles with too much leisure. Yet they reveal something profound about how medieval people grappled with the contradictions of their world. On one hand, they lived in a society where marriages were transactions and desire was often condemned. On the other hand, they were human beings, yearning for passion, expression, and connection. The court of love became a stage where these contradictions could be safely explored, dressed in the clothing of debate rather than the scandal of action. Through metaphor and argument, people could express longings they dared not live openly. There are curious tales of disputes brought before such courts, some of them almost theatrical in their intensity. One story tells of a knight who asked whether he should remain loyal to his lady, who had grown cold, or seek comfort elsewhere. The court debated fiercely before deciding that true love demanded perseverance, even when unrewarded. Another case involved a question of whether a kiss, stolen without consent, could ever be considered love. The judgment was harsh. Love without consent was not love at all, but insult. And these verdicts may sound trivial, yet they offered moral frameworks for people living in a world where emotions often clashed with rigid structures of law and religion. The prominence of women in these settings cannot be overlooked. In daily life, their voices were silenced, their choices confined, and their bodies controlled. But in the court of love, they became arbiters of passion, judges of fidelity, and guardians of honor. This inversion of roles was more than play. It was a glimpse of another possibility, a subtle challenge to the authority of men. Through the language of romance, women could exercise influence they were otherwise denied, shaping ideals of devotion that men were expected to follow. It is no coincidence that some of the most famous champions of courtly love, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, were women whose political and cultural power extended far beyond the domestic sphere. Still, the courts of love existed in tension with the realities outside their walls. The knight who swore eternal devotion in debate might still be bound to marry another for political gain. The lady who judged eloquently about fidelity might herself be promised to a husband she scarcely knew. These contradictions only heightened the allure of the game, for it created a parallel universe where passion could be entertained, if not truly lived. Listeners and participants knew that the rules were fragile, that the freedom they tasted in these debates would vanish once the doors of the hall closed. And yet, the taste itself was enough to keep the tradition alive. What makes these courts so fascinating is not whether they were widespread or rare, but how they reveal the medieval struggle to reconcile desire with duty. They show us that even within the strict confines of arranged unions and religious control, people long to experiment with the idea of love as something that could be chosen, celebrated, and even legislated. The fact that they dressed these longings in the form of playful trials only underscores how dangerous and radical the concept of free love truly was in their world. The echoes of these debates linger in literature, where stories of knights, ladies, and impossible devotion became some of the most enduring legacies of the Middle Ages. The romances of Chrétien de Troyes, the poetry of troubadours, and the later tales of Arthurian legends all bear the imprint of these conversations. Through them, the ideals of the court of love reached far beyond the noble halls where they began, shaping the imagination of Europe for centuries to come. And this is perhaps the deepest irony. While most medieval men and women lived without freedom to choose their heart's path, they built entire worlds of words where love reigned supreme. They codified rules, staged trials, and sang songs not because they could live by them, but because they longed to. In their longing lies the truth of the Middle Ages. Love was not absent, but constrained. And it was precisely this constraint that gave it its unforgettable intensity. The presence of the church in the medieval world was inescapable, and nowhere did its influence weigh more heavily than in the realm of love and marriage. Every glance, every touch, every vow between two people was shadowed by the voice of religion, which set the boundaries for what was pure and what was sinful. To fall in love was not just a matter of emotion, it was a matter of salvation. The church claimed the authority to define whether affection was holy or damned, whether a union was blessed by God or condemned as lust. This power turned desire into something dangerous, a fire that could warm the soul but just as easily consume it in eternal punishment. Clerics preached constantly about the dangers of passion. Love that burned too brightly was labeled concupiscence, a disorder of the flesh that threatened to drag souls into sin. Couples were told to approach marriage with restraint. not as a celebration of desire, but as a solemn duty to procreate and maintain social order. To feel too much, to long too deeply, was to risk offending both heaven and community. This did not mean that love was absent, but it meant that every spark of feeling had to fight its way through sermons, confessions, and the fear of divine judgment. A single kiss, if too charged with passion, could weigh on the conscience like a mortal sin. At the same time, the Church elevated marriage to the status of sacrament, which gave it both sacred dignity and suffocating rigidity. The promise of marriage was no longer simply a contract between families, but a spiritual bond overseen by God himself. Once exchanged, it was indissoluble. Divorce, as we understand it today, was forbidden. Separation might be allowed in cases of abuse or abandonment, but the marriage itself remained intact in the eyes of the Church. This made unions permanent prisons for many, especially women, who could not escape unhappy or abusive arrangements without facing severe consequences. What was meant to sanctify love often became the very chain that bound it in silence. And yet, the Church also created loopholes that lovers tried to exploit. Because consent was central to the sacrament, a man and woman could marry each other simply by exchanging vows in private. This clandestine marriage, known as sponsalia per verba de praesenti, was recognized as valid in God's eyes, even if no priest had blessed it. Such secret vows became lifelines for couples trying to defy their families, a way to transform passion into legitimacy. But the same loophole also created chaos, for people could claim to be married on the flimsiest evidence, and courts became clogged with disputes over who had truly spoken the binding words. These blurred lines reveal how even the strict hand of religion could not completely control the unpredictability of the human heart. The Church also sought to regulate courtship itself, condemning practices it deemed dangerous or excessive. Festivals and dances, where men and women mingled freely, often drew the suspicion of priests who saw them as breeding grounds for temptation. Confessors asked probing questions about even the smallest gestures between lovers, turning desire into a matter of spiritual surveillance. A young woman might find herself accused of sin for exchanging a ribbon with her suitor, while a young man could be chastised for dwelling too long in thought on the beauty of his beloved. This constant policing of emotion turned love into something perilous, as if every heartbeat needed permission to exist. Ironically, while the Church condemned passion, it also fueled it indirectly. By forbidding so much, it made desire more intense. Lovers who were told their affection was sinful often clung to it with greater desperation, as if defiance itself proved its authenticity. The shadow of sin heightened the thrill, turning ordinary gestures into acts of rebellion. A kiss stolen outside the churchyard was not just a kiss, it was defiance of heaven and earth alike. The very rules meant to suppress passion often ended up sharpening it, making love feel more dangerous, more intoxicating, and more unforgettable. Clerical writings reveal another paradox. While priests condemned lust, some also celebrated spiritualized versions of love. The writings of Bernard of Clairvaux, for instance, compared divine love to an intoxicating union, blurring the line between mystical ecstasy and physical passion. Mystics described their encounters with God in the language of desire, borrowing imagery that sounded startlingly close to the words of lovers. This strange overlap shows how deeply intertwined love and religion were in the medieval imagination. Even when passion was condemned, it could not be entirely erased. It resurfaced, sublimated into visions of divine embrace. For ordinary people, the Church's authority created a constant tension. They longed to love, but they feared the eternal consequences of desire. Confession became a place where lovers poured out not only their sins, but their emotions, hoping for forgiveness while secretly clutching to what they could not give up. Priests heard countless stories of forbidden kisses, secret vows, and lingering touches, and each absolution became another thread in the complicated tapestry of love and faith. The confessional booth was as much a theater of desire as it was of repentance, for it revealed how impossible it was to separate the sacred from the passionate. Even the calendar of love was shaped by religion. Marriages were forbidden during Lent and Advent, seasons of fasting and reflection, which meant that couples often had to delay their unions for months. The rhythm of affection was dictated not by personal desire, but by the liturgical year. Weddings were celebrated in churchyards rather than inside churches, reinforcing the idea that marriage was both sacred and public. Every step of affection was marked and monitored, until love itself felt less like a private journey and more like a pilgrimage under constant watch. And yet, in spite of the Church's power, passion found ways to bloom. Lovers stole time during pilgrimages, met beneath the noise of festivals, and carved their names into cloister walls as secret oaths. The very structures designed to contain them became stages for their defiance. The presence of the Church gave love in the Middle Ages its peculiar sharpness, forcing it to exist between fear and faith, suppression and survival. It was not just a personal emotion, it was a negotiation with eternity. And it is precisely in this fragile balance, where heaven loomed over every heartbeat, that love became unforgettable. To risk sin for affection, to gamble salvation for a kiss, to whisper vows in the shadow of the altar, these acts gave medieval romance a weight unlike any other. Love in this world was never simple, never safe, but always profound. It demanded courage, not just against families and politics, but against the eternal judgment of God himself. And in that struggle, love gained a power that still echoes in our imagination today, a reminder that even when bound by chains of faith, the human heart has always found a way to rebel. The obsession with chastity in the Middle Ages was not merely a personal virtue, it was a form of currency that defined families, communities, and entire dynasties. Virginity, particularly for women, was seen as proof of honor, a fragile treasure that once lost could never be restored. It was not only her own reputation at stake, but the standing of her parents, siblings, and even extended kin. A girl's purity could determine whether her family prospered through an advantageous marriage or fell into disgrace. It was a standard so heavy that it turned love itself into a battlefield of suspicion, fear, and endless watchfulness. From the moment of adolescence, young women were taught that their worth resided in their untouched bodies. Their movements were restricted, their clothing carefully monitored, and their interactions with men guarded. To even be seen alone with a suitor could spark rumors that damaged their prospects forever. In this sense, chastity was less about personal morality than about surveillance. Families acted as guardians of a girl's reputation, watching every glance and step as though her very body were a vault holding their collective future. For young men, too, chastity carried meaning, though it was often celebrated more for discipline and honor than for purity itself. Knights were expected to restrain themselves until marriage, their self-control seen as a mark of strength, but the burden fell most heavily on women, who carried the blame for any perceived lapse. Consider the rituals of courtship under this shadow. A stolen kiss, an embrace, even a whispered meeting could spark catastrophic consequences. Chronicles tell of maidens banished to convents for the mere suspicion of impropriety, where they lived out their days under vows they never chose. Others were married off hastily, their reputations salvaged by binding them to the very men who compromised them. Love became less a tender feeling than a risk calculation. Every gesture weighed against the possibility of disgrace. To touch was to gamble with destiny, and most gambles ended badly for women. This reality turned every encounter between lovers into something charged with danger, where passion and fear could never be separated. Chastity was also tied to economics. Dowries were often negotiated on the assumption that a bride was untouched, her body as unspoiled as the land she brought into the union. If a woman's chastity was questioned, her value in negotiations diminished, sometimes drastically. Families guarded their daughters as they would guard their wealth, seeing no difference between financial fortune and bodily integrity. This commodification of purity stripped love of its spontaneity, turning affection into an investment at risk of depreciation. A suitor's interest might vanish if whispers spread, no matter how baseless they were. A young woman could lose everything, not because of what she had done, but because of what others believed she had done. The irony is that this obsession with chastity created a culture of secrets and disguises. Lovers, forbidden to express themselves openly, turned to clandestine meetings, symbolic gifts, and coded letters to keep their bonds alive. This secrecy gave passion an intensity that might not have existed had it been freely allowed. The very prohibition transformed desire into something sacred, even mystical. To risk chastity was to risk one's entire world, and yet many still dared. Proof that the pull of the heart was stronger than the weight of fear. In this way, chastity was both a prison and the spark that ignited defiance, forcing lovers to invent languages of passion hidden in plain sight. Religious ideals further deepened the obsession. The Virgin Mary was exalted as the model of purity, her untouched body celebrated as the ultimate symbol of holiness. Women were measured against this impossible standard, their worth tied to their resemblance to an unreachable ideal. Sermons warned against lust, confessors interrogated penitents about their desires, and saints' lives praised those who remained celibate. In this spiritual climate, chastity became not just a social duty, but a pathway to salvation. To fail was to endanger not only one's future on earth, but one's soul in eternity. This immense pressure twisted love into a struggle not only against human law, but against divine judgment. And yet, cracks in the system always appeared. Stories spread of noble women who resisted arranged marriages by claiming spiritual chastity, declaring themselves brides of Christ to avoid unions they despised. Some women entered convents not out of devotion, but as a form of rebellion, choosing a life of cloistered purity over a loveless political marriage. Men, too, sometimes broke the rules, their affairs creating scandals that the church tried desperately to control. These acts of defiance reveal how chastity, far from being universally embraced, was contested ground, a stage where people negotiated survival in a system that tried to dictate their very bodies. Even literature reflected the tension. Courtly love poetry often celebrated a woman's purity while simultaneously longing to overcome it. Troubadour praised their ladies as untouchable stars, divine in their chastity, yet sang of yearning that strained against the boundaries of virtue. The paradox was clear. Purity was worshipped, but desire was irresistible. This contradiction shaped medieval romance into something uniquely bittersweet, where love always hovered on the edge of sin, forever caught between reverence and temptation. For ordinary people, the weight of chastity was just as real. Peasant communities judged harshly those who transgressed, and gossip could destroy lives as effectively as the decree of a noble or a priest. Yet among the lower classes, where survival often depended on practicality, love sometimes found freer ground. Couples might live together before marriage, their unions tolerated as long as they fulfilled communal responsibilities. Still, the shadow of chastity lingered, for even in the humblest villages, a woman's reputation remained a fragile thread that could be snapped by a single accusation. The obsession with chastity did more than shape individual lives. It shaped the very fabric of medieval culture. It dictated how families negotiated marriages, how the church defined morality, how communities enforced norms, and how lovers invented ways to resist. It was both the guardian and the enemy of romance, the standard by which affection was measured and the barrier that suffocated it. And perhaps this is why medieval love feels so intense to us today, because it was lived under the constant weight of a virtue that threatened to crush it. In that suffocating climate, passion did not disappear. It adapted. It became sharper, riskier, and more inventive, flourishing in secrecy and defiance. The demand for chastity made love more dangerous, and in danger, love grew fierce. Every glance, every touch, every whispered vow carried the weight of scandal and salvation, binding hearts tighter, precisely because the world tried so hard to pull them apart. And it was in this tension between purity and passion that the most unforgettable romances of the Middle Ages were born, preparing the stage for even greater conflicts between desire and fear. The tradition of troubadours and the culture of courtly love reshaped the way medieval people thought about romance, offering a vision that was both intoxicating and impossible. Troubadours, poets and musicians who flourished, especially in the courts of southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries, crafted songs that elevated love to a near religious devotion. But the love they celebrated was not the marital kind approved by church and family. Instead, it was a longing often directed toward a distant or unattainable lady, usually married or far above the poet's station. The beauty of this tradition lay not in fulfillment, but in the ache of desire, a yearning so powerful it transformed suffering into glory. Their songs described love as service, with the lover cast in the role of a humble vassal and the lady in that of a sovereign lord. Just as a knight pledged loyalty to his feudal master, so too did he pledge his heart to his chosen lady, serving her with devotion, secrecy, and endurance. This language turned passion into a structured ritual, giving it the dignity of honor, while also ensuring that it remained distant and unfulfilled. To desire was to ennoble oneself. To achieve satisfaction was almost to ruin the purity of the feeling. The highest form of love in this vision was not consummation but constancy, an endless longing that sharpened the soul. What made this so compelling is that it ran against the grain of medieval society, where marriages were arranged for property and politics. Troubadours gave voice to the frustration of a world in which love rarely dictated unions. They created an alternate reality where the heart, not the dowry, chose its path. Of course, this reality was often more poetic than practical. Few knights truly defied their families for the sake of passion, but the songs allowed them to imagine it. Listeners could dream of a love untethered by obligation, even if they returned the next morning to the duties of arranged matches. In this way, the poetry of courtly love became both a rebellion and a consolation, a way to live emotionally what could not be lived in fact. The secrecy that defined courtly love mirrored the realities of forbidden romance. Lovers often had to conceal their affections beneath codes and symbols, and troubadours did the same with language. They used metaphors drawn from nature, roses, falcons, rivers, to disguise intimate meaning. A song about a spring bloom might actually be a declaration of passion. This coded language made poetry a shield as much as an expression, protecting both the speaker and the subject from scandal. It also invited listeners to read between the lines, to engage with the game of interpretation, which made the act of listening itself part of the experience of desire. The paradox of this tradition is that it elevated women to a place of power, even as real medieval women remained restricted. In the poems, the lady was untouchable, revered, even divine. She was the axis of meaning, the reason for the knight's courage, the judge of his worth. Men measured themselves by her gaze, her approval, her distant acknowledgement. This poetic reverence contrasted sharply with reality, where women were often treated as pawns in political arrangements. Yet within the world of the troubadour, she was sovereign. This imaginative reversal gave audiences a glimpse of a different order of things, one where women could inspire and command rather than merely obey. But the courtly love tradition was not without its tensions. By idealizing unattainability, it often reinforced the very barriers it seemed to challenge. To love within marriage, to find satisfaction, was considered too ordinary for poetry. Instead, desire was most beautiful when it remained unresolved. This created a culture where longing itself was prized above fulfillment, where suffering was worn like a badge of honor. It glorified the impossible, which made it captivating but also cruel, trapping lovers in an endless cycle of yearning with no resolution. The influence of troubadour poetry spread far beyond southern France. It shaped the romances of northern Europe, inspiring writers such as Chrétien de Troyes, whose tales of King Arthur's court became some of the most enduring stories of the Middle Ages. In these narratives, the ideals of courtly love were woven into tales of adventure, where knights proved their devotion not only through combat but through fidelity to their ladies. The themes of secrecy, longing, and unattainability became cornerstones of medieval literature, echoing in countless variations across Europe. Even centuries later, echoes of troubadour ideals lingered. Dante, in his Vita Nuova, described his devotion to Beatrice in terms that reflected courtly love, exalting her as a near-divine figure whose mere presence transformed his soul. Petrarch's obsession with Laura followed the same pattern. A woman distant, often silent, yet powerful enough to define a man's entire poetic universe. These traditions show how the troubadour's vision of love, intense, painful, and transcendent, continued to shape European culture long after the songs themselves faded from the courts. What captivates us about this tradition is how it turned love into both suffering and salvation. It insisted that desire was not a weakness, but a path to nobility, that the fire of longing could refine a person as much as prayer or battle. But it also revealed the cost of a world where fulfillment was always just out of reach. To live in the courtly tradition was to embrace contradiction, to worship love while denying its consummation, to suffer willingly because the suffering itself was proof of devotion. And in that contradiction lies its enduring allure. The troubadour's song was not simply a melody of longing, it was a mirror of medieval life, where people dreamed of freedom but lived under restraint, where passion was both feared and worshipped, where the heart could never escape the chains of duty. It was this unresolved tension between reality and imagination, desire and denial, that made the culture of courtly love one of the most haunting legacies of the Middle Ages, and one that prepared the stage for even deeper conflicts between love, secrecy, and survival. Secrecy was the lifeblood of medieval romance, and without it, many love stories would never have survived. In a society where marriages were arranged, meetings were supervised, and every glance was scrutinized, lovers relied on intermediaries to carry the fragile weight of their desires. These go-betweens, servants, friends, priests, even children, became the silent architects of romance, moving letters, tokens, and whispered messages between two people who could not risk being seen together. Their role was dangerous, for discovery could mean not only disgrace for the lovers, but punishment for the messenger. Yet their presence reveals how far people were willing to go to protect the secret fire of affection in a world designed to extinguish it. Imagine a lady locked in the watchful confines of her father's hall, unable to meet her admirer without scandal. Her maid, trusted since childhood, slips a folded parchment into her sleeve as she pours wine at supper. That maid becomes more than a servant, she becomes the keeper of her mistress's heart. Without her loyalty, the romance dies. Without her discretion, the secret becomes a scandal. This dependency created bonds of trust that were as intense as the romances themselves. A single careless word could destroy reputations, so loyalty had to be absolute. The messenger's silence became a form of devotion equal to the lover's passion. The use of intermediaries was not limited to households. Priests and confessors were sometimes drawn into the web of secrecy, willingly or unwillingly. A lover might entrust a message to a cleric under the guise of confession, relying on the sanctity of the church to shield his intent. Monks and nuns, despite their vows, occasionally facilitated such exchanges, moved by pity for the lovers or drawn into intrigue. There are even accounts of children carrying notes, their innocence serving as camouflage. Who would suspect a boy with a basket of bread or a girl with a bundle of cloth of hiding a letter filled with forbidden passion? These seemingly unlikely couriers remind us how creative love became when faced with impossible barriers. But secrecy carried its own price. Every additional person brought into the circle of trust multiplied the risk of betrayal. Servants might be bribed or threatened, priests might reveal more than they should, and children might speak too freely. Whole romances collapsed not because of the lovers themselves, but because a messenger failed. The fragility of these arrangements added an edge of constant fear to every exchange. A lover did not simply worry whether his letter would reach his beloved. He worried whether it would reach the wrong hands, whether it would be read aloud in the cold echo of a court, or displayed before furious parents. Love was never just a matter of the heart, it was a matter of strategy and survival. This culture of secrecy shaped the very form of medieval romance. Letters were written in code, filled with metaphors that only the recipient could decode. Words of affection might be disguised as lines of scripture, making them appear harmless if intercepted. Gifts were chosen for their hidden meanings, their true message invisible to outsiders. A lock of hair braided into a ribbon, a sprig of rosemary slipped into a pouch, a carefully folded piece of cloth. All of these became languages of their own, understood only by two people and their confidants. The messenger carried not just objects, but entire dictionaries of symbols, each one a lifeline of hidden communication. Literature of the time reflects this fascination with secrecy. In countless romances, the faithful servant or clever companion plays a central role, guiding lovers through the labyrinth of surveillance. These characters are rarely the heroes of the story, but without them, no love could endure. Their presence mirrors reality, where few lovers were bold enough or foolish enough to act entirely alone. The fact that these figures appear again and again in poems and tales shows how essential they were, not only in fiction, but in life. To love was to conspire, and no conspiracy could survive without accomplices. Yet secrecy also added intensity to love itself. The more dangerous the meeting, the sweeter the moment. Lovers measured their devotion not by ease, but by obstacles overcome. A letter carried through shadows, a glance stolen during Mass, a touch exchanged under a cloak. These acts burned with a power that ordinary gestures could never match. The risk was part of the reward. To know that one's words had crossed through so many hands, through so much danger, before reaching the beloved, gave them a weight that no open declaration could equal. Passion in the Middle Ages was sharpened by peril, and secrecy was the blade that honed it. There were also cases where secrecy went too far, creating tragedies instead of triumphs. Lovers might trust the wrong confidant, only to be betrayed for money or favor. Messages could be altered, twisted to sow doubt and jealousy. Rumors, once unleashed, could not be contained, and what began as a carefully hidden romance could erupt into scandal with devastating speed. Some stories tell of messengers tortured for information, forced to reveal details that destroyed their masters. These cautionary tales remind us that secrecy was not simply thrilling, it was lethal. Love walked hand in hand with danger, and even the most loyal confidant could falter under pressure. What makes this culture of secrecy so haunting is how it reveals the determination of the human heart. People risked everything, status, wealth, even their lives, for the chance to express what they felt. They built elaborate systems of trust and disguise, not because they were foolish, but because they had no other choice. The world denied them freedom, so they carved freedom out of shadows, out of whispers, out of the hands of servants and friends. Secrecy was not just a method, it was a form of resistance against a society that sought to dictate every detail of affection. And this resistance gave love its sharpest edge. The forbidden became irresistible, the hidden became sacred, and the fragile became unforgettable. Every letter delivered in silence, every token passed from hand to hand, was more than an act of affection. It was an act of defiance. And in that defiance, medieval love found its most enduring strength, setting the stage for still more daring gestures, where intimacy was not only whispered, but embodied in tokens that carried the very essence of the self. In the medieval world, where love was bound by silence, duty, and surveillance, tokens of affection carried a weight far greater than their size. These were not mere trinkets handed lightly between admirers. They were fragments of identity, infused with emotion, secrecy, and risk. The giving of a personal object, whether a lock of hair, a strip of cloth, or even a drop of blood, was a way to leave behind a piece of oneself in the possession of another. These objects became talismans, charged with meaning, representing both the intensity of devotion and the peril of discovery. To hold such a token was to hold proof of a bond that existed outside the structures of family, church, and society. A lock of hair was among the most intimate gifts a person could give. Hair was seen not only as a marker of beauty, but as a part of the body itself, something that carried the essence of the giver. When a woman cut a strand of her hair and placed it in the hands of her lover, she was offering him more than ornament. She was giving a fragment of her physical presence, something that could be touched when she could not. Knights often carried these locks tied to their armor or sewn into their tunics, believing them to be both a charm of protection and a reminder of loyalty. The sight of a knight riding into battle with a lady's hair upon his breast was not merely symbolic. It was a declaration to all that his courage was bound to her. Pieces of fabric carried similar significance. A ribbon, a veil, or a sleeve taken from a gown could become a treasure beyond price. These tokens were often infused with the scent of the giver, lingering reminders of presence that words alone could not capture. There are tales of knights wearing a lady's sleeve into jousts, the fabric fluttering from their lances as a public yet disguised signal of private devotion. In this way, an object as ordinary as a strip of cloth became a battlefield standard, announcing to the world that the knight's valor was fueled not only by honor but by desire. Yet such symbols were double-edged. To carry them openly was to invite gossip, while to hide them too carefully was to risk them being lost or forgotten. More striking still were the tokens that crossed into the realm of the body itself. Some lovers exchanged rings carved not from gold, but from bone, sometimes even their own. Others are said to have drawn blood, sealing their devotion with drops captured on cloth or parchment. While these accounts may sound extreme, they reflect the medieval fascination with the mingling of body and soul. To give blood or bone was to blur the line between the symbolic and the literal, offering a piece of one's very life as proof of fidelity. These visceral gifts show how desperately people sought to make love tangible, to root it in objects that could outlast absence and distance. Yet the exchange of such tokens was never free from danger. A lock of hair discovered in the wrong hands could become evidence of impropriety. A ribbon could spark scandal, and a stained cloth might be used as proof of an illicit bond. In courts and confessions, tokens were sometimes presented as legal testimony of secret vows or clandestine unions. What had begun as a whisper of intimacy could transform into a public weapon, tearing apart reputations and altering destinies. The very objects meant to protect love could just as easily betray it. Every exchange carried the thrill of closeness and the shadow of catastrophe. Despite the risks, the tradition endured because tokens provided something words could not. They were physical anchors in a world of uncertainty, reminders that the beloved was real, even when distance or duty kept them apart. For a knight on campaign, holding a ribbon might ease the loneliness of endless marches. For a woman confined in her family's hall, touching a carved trinket might keep alive the hope that her devotion was not forgotten. In these objects, love became portable, survivable, capable of crossing distances that neither letters nor meetings could bridge. They were, in essence, the physical language of longing. Literature immortalized this practice, weaving it into the fabric of medieval imagination. In romances and epics, knights treasured tokens from their ladies, while heroines clung to the smallest reminders of absent lovers. These stories mirrored reality, showing how tokens were not just private treasures, but cultural symbols that carried meaning across generations. Audiences recognized their power because they, too, lived in a world where affection had to be hidden in plain sight, smuggled into objects that could be touched, kissed, or carried without words. The literature amplified the romance of these exchanges, turning them into ideals, even as the risks were well understood. One of the most compelling aspects of these tokens is how they blurred the line between devotion and possession. To carry someone's hair or blood was to claim a part of them, to hold them even in absence. But it was also to bear responsibility, for the object demanded loyalty in return. To lose or discard such a token was an act of betrayal, an unspoken declaration that the bond had ended. Thus, the object itself carried not only love, but obligation. It demanded constancy, binding both giver and receiver in a silent contract that could not be easily broken. This intertwining of affection, danger, and duty made tokens more than simple gifts. They were symbols of love's resilience in a hostile world. They testified that even when lovers could not be together, they could still be present for one another in some form. The token was proof that desire had found a way to survive silence and surveillance, proof that even in a society that denied freedom of choice, individuals could carve out spaces of intimacy. And in this carving, they prepared the ground for even more dramatic negotiations, where marriage itself was arranged long before two hearts had any say, binding people into fates that often left no room for passion at all. In the medieval world, marriage was rarely about choice, and nowhere was this more evident than in the practice of betrothals arranged during childhood. For many boys and girls, their fates were sealed before they even understood the meaning of love. A child could be promised in marriage as early as infancy, her name tied to a future she had no voice in shaping. These early arrangements were not seen as cruel at the time, but as practical necessities, weaving together family fortunes, political alliances, and dynastic ambitions. Love, if it came at all, was expected to bloom after vows had already been sealed, like an afterthought grafted onto a contract. Imagine a noble girl of 5 years old, dressed in fine garments at her father's hall, her hand symbolically placed into that of a boy scarcely older than herself. In that moment, her destiny was decided, not by affection, not by attraction, but by land deeds, military support, or trade routes. She would grow up with the knowledge that her life belonged to another family, that her body was part of an agreement struck long before she had words to protest. The sense of inevitability weighed heavily on many, for it meant that the natural blossoming of youthful affection was often irrelevant. The heart could be ignored, but the promise could not. Betrothals made in childhood often spanned many years, and with them came a strange kind of waiting game. As children grew, they were reminded constantly of the futures awaiting them. Letters might be exchanged between families to reaffirm the contract, dowries negotiated and renegotiated, and alliances strengthened by the reminder that a union was already secured. Some children grew up knowing their future spouse by name but not by face, and when the wedding day finally arrived, they were often strangers standing at the altar. The gap between expectation and reality could be vast, and many couples discovered too late that they shared nothing but obligation. The church both sanctified and complicated these arrangements. While it insisted that consent was necessary for a valid marriage, it also allowed parental influence to weigh heavily, especially in noble families. Consent could be assumed rather than freely given, with silence interpreted as agreement. For a young girl pressured by family, silence often became the only option. And once vows were spoken, even under duress, the union was considered binding in the eyes of God. Thus, a system designed to protect the sanctity of marriage often became a trap, locking children into futures they had never chosen. Not all childhood betrothals ended in successful unions. Many were broken when political landscapes shifted or fortunes changed. A promised bride might find herself abandoned if her dowry no longer seemed sufficient, her value dismissed like a piece of property. Some were even cast aside after years of preparation, leaving them tainted by the perception of rejection and making future matches more difficult. These broken promises could spark resentment between families, sometimes erupting into feuds or political strife. Marriage was never just about two people. It was a web of obligations that could tighten or unravel with devastating effect. Despite the rigidity of these arrangements, history does record rare instances where genuine affection managed to grow within them. Some couples, having been betrothed since childhood, developed familiarity that gradually turned into companionship, and in rare cases, even love. Growing up with the knowledge that they belonged to one another sometimes created bonds of loyalty that transcended duty. Yet these stories are the exceptions rather than the rule, celebrated precisely because they were so unusual in a world where marriages were more often burdens than blessings. For many, however, the knowledge of a predetermined marriage stifled the possibility of pursuing personal desire. A young man who developed feelings for another woman, or a girl who fell in love with someone outside her arranged match, faced an impossible choice between rebellion and resignation. Those who dared to defy their families risked exile, loss of inheritance, or even imprisonment. The tragedy of childhood betrothals lies not only in the loss of freedom, but in the suffocation of dreams before they could even take shape. Love, in these cases, became less a possibility and more a forbidden fantasy. The practice also highlights the deep inequality of medieval marriage. Boys, though also subjected to arranged unions, often had greater leeway to resist or renegotiate than girls. A young man might delay his vows or seek dispensation through the church, but a young woman was almost always bound tightly by her family's will. Her body and future were bargaining chips, traded with little regard for her desires. This imbalance reveals how love in the Middle Ages was not only constrained by politics and religion, but also by gender, with women carrying the heaviest burdens of a system that treated them as vessels of alliance rather than individuals with their own hearts. What makes the practice of childhood betrothals so striking is how it reflects the broader medieval view of love as secondary to survival. Families believed they were securing stability, protecting their lineages, and ensuring prosperity. But in doing so, they often erased the possibility of spontaneous affection. The human need for connection did not disappear, however. It simply had to find other outlets, often in secrecy or rebellion. The very system designed to control love only made it more unruly, forcing it to hide in shadows, to whisper through poetry, or to risk everything in forbidden affairs. And this is where the greatest tension emerges. For every child promised to a stranger, there were others who dared to resist, to claim that love should not be dictated by contract alone. Their defiance, whether successful or crushed, revealed the cracks in a system that tried to subdue the heart. In those cracks, passion bloomed, sometimes bright enough to alter destinies, sometimes fading under the weight of obligation. Childhood betrothals remind us that medieval love was never simple. It was always caught between duty and desire, between the future imposed by others and the fragile hope of choosing one's own path. And in that fragile hope, the seeds were planted for the even more dangerous realm of forbidden romances, where the cost of defiance could be ruin, yet the reward was the chance to truly live. Forbidden love in the Middle Ages was a dangerous gamble, one that carried the potential for both ecstasy and ruin. In a society where every aspect of affection was scrutinized, where marriages were arranged, reputations guarded, and chastity worshipped, those who dared to step outside the rules risked everything. And yet, it was precisely this risk that gave such romances their power. To love against the will of family or church was to challenge not only social expectations, but sometimes the very order of heaven and earth. Each glance, each meeting, each secret word exchanged carried with it the possibility of destruction, and it was in that tension that passion burned most brightly. Imagine a noblewoman promised in marriage since childhood, her destiny tied to a man she barely knows. When her heart instead turns toward a knight of lesser rank, every instinct tells her the choice is impossible. Her family would brand her disloyal, the church would condemn her, and the community would whisper her name in scandal. Yet the pull is undeniable, and so she risks a stolen encounter in a quiet corridor, her every step haunted by the threat of discovery. That one moment of closeness, fleeting, trembling, forbidden, becomes more intoxicating than a lifetime of duty. It is not simply desire that drives her, but the thrill of defiance, the knowledge that she is touching a freedom she has never been allowed to claim. The risks of forbidden love were not limited to social disgrace. In some cases, they led to brutal punishment. Chronicles describe women locked away in convents as penance for falling in love outside arranged marriages. Men who pursued married women could face exile, imprisonment, or even death if caught. Among the nobility, the consequences were often political. A love affair discovered could unravel alliances, spark feuds, or ignite wars. The stakes were so high that even the suspicion of impropriety could destroy families. And yet, history is filled with examples of people who still chose to risk it, suggesting that the force of desire was stronger than fear itself. The story of Abelard and Heloise is one of the most famous testaments to this peril. Abelard, A brilliant philosopher fell in love with his young student Eloise, and their passion became an infamous scandal. When their affair was discovered, Eloise was forced into a convent, and Abelard suffered a brutal punishment that marked him for life. Yet their letters, exchanged long after they were separated, reveal a love so intense that not even violence or religious vows could extinguish it. Their tragedy demonstrates how forbidden love in the Middle Ages was not just about personal risk, but about the ways in which society used force to control the heart. And still, the heart resisted. Secrecy became the essential ingredient of these romances. Lovers met in gardens under moonlight, in chapels during Mass, or in crowded festivals where a passing glance could be hidden in the chaos. They created languages of symbols, knots tied into ribbons, flowers chosen for their meanings, words coded in poetry, to preserve their bonds against the surveillance of families and priests. Every token carried the weight of rebellion, and every whisper was a gamble. What might seem to us today as small gestures were, in their world, acts of extraordinary courage. The more forbidden the love, the more inventive its expressions had to become. Yet, forbidden love was not always tragic. In some cases, it transformed into stories of survival and triumph. A few couples managed to elope, fleeing into distant lands where they could carve out new lives away from the grip of family and duty. Others sought refuge in the loopholes of church law, invoking the rule that private vows could constitute a valid marriage. These stories are rare, but they reveal the determination of people who believed that love was worth the chaos it brought. Their defiance left marks on history, proof that even in an age of strict control, passion could alter the course of lives. The fascination with forbidden love was so widespread that it seeped deeply into medieval literature. Tales of Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, and countless other romances captured audiences because they dramatized the tension between duty and desire. These stories were not mere entertainment, they were reflections of the realities people lived. The audience recognized themselves in the impossible choices of fictional lovers, seeing their own hidden longings mirrored in tales of knights and queens. The popularity of these stories reveals that forbidden love was not an exception but a pervasive shadow across the medieval landscape, haunting both nobles and commoners alike. Even among peasants, where political alliances were less pressing, forbidden love existed in different forms. A girl promised to a man chosen for his land or labor might secretly meet a boy she truly admired, slipping away after work or stealing glances at village festivals. For them, the danger was not dynastic collapse, but communal shame. Gossip could travel faster than fire, and a woman suspected of impropriety might be ostracized, while a man could lose standing among his peers. Forbidden love in the village was quieter than in the castle, but no less intense, for it carried the same mixture of desire and dread. Religious ideals made the danger even sharper. The church preached that adulterous love was a mortal sin, threatening the salvation of the soul. Yet this very condemnation added to its intensity. Lovers who dared to defy the church did so not only against family and society, but against God himself. This transformed passion into something both terrifying and ecstatic, a feeling that seemed larger than life, larger than law. To risk damnation for a kiss or a touch was to gamble with eternity, and the sheer audacity of that gamble made the love feel all the more consuming. The allure of forbidden love lay in its paradox. It was at once destructive and creative, capable of ruining lives, but also capable of producing the most enduring legends of the age. Its very impossibility gave it power, forcing people to fight harder for moments that others took for granted. Every danger sharpened the sweetness, every obstacle deepened the longing. It was not safe, it was not sustainable, but it was unforgettable. And it is precisely because it was forbidden that it became the purest expression of rebellion against a society that sought to suffocate the heart. And so, as forbidden love continued to weave its way through halls and villages, churches and fields, it left behind stories that remind us how desire refuses to be contained. These stories, whispered then and remembered now, prepared the ground for the final reckoning of medieval romance. The constant tension between passion and sin, a world where love itself was inseparable from guilt, and where the human heart learned to exist in the narrow space between fire and judgment. The medieval view of passion was inseparable from the concept of sin, and this tension cast a long shadow over every form of love. To desire too intensely, to pursue affection outside the boundaries of marriage, or even to think lustful thoughts, was to risk the eternal fate of the soul. The Church preached constantly that passion untamed was a dangerous fire, capable of consuming not only bodies, but salvation itself. Sermons warned that carnal desire was a pathway to hell, a snare set by the devil to lure the faithful away from God's grace, and yet human hearts beat faster despite the warnings. The more love was condemned, the more irresistible it became. Every secret embrace carried not only the thrill of intimacy, but the burden of guilt, and in this mixture of sweetness and fear, medieval romance became unlike any other in history. Confessionals became stages for this conflict. Men and women poured out their hearts to priests, admitting to stolen kisses, furtive touches, or even the burning thoughts that plagued their nights. A single moment of passion could weigh on a conscience like a crime, forcing the penitent to seek absolution. But absolution did not erase desire, it only deepened the cycle, where lovers sinned, confessed, and sinned again. Priests often heard the same stories, repeated endlessly, proof that the battle between love and sin was unwinnable. The booth of repentance became a theater of longing, where forbidden feelings were spoken aloud yet never extinguished. Each confession reminded people how fragile their salvation was, and how dangerously strong their hearts could be. What makes this struggle so fascinating is the way it turned desire into something larger than itself. A kiss was not just a kiss, it was a threat to the soul's eternal destiny. To lay eyes too long on someone else's spouse was to risk damnation. Even dreams could be judged, with theologians warning that lustful thoughts in sleep revealed a corrupt spirit. This relentless moral scrutiny heightened the intensity of love because it infused it with cosmic consequences. To touch someone's hand in secret was to gamble with heaven and hell, and that gamble made the moment sear itself into memory. Love in the Middle Ages was never just about two people, it was about eternity. Literature reflected this spiritual weight in unforgettable ways. The legend of Tristan and Isolde, one of the most famous medieval romances, is steeped in this conflict. Their love, born from a potion but carried forward by genuine devotion, defied marriage, duty, and morality. Every embrace between them was both an act of passion and an act of sin, and it is precisely this duality that gave their story its tragic power. Audiences did not merely see two lovers, they saw two souls risking damnation for the sake of desire. The tragedy lay not only in their deaths, but in the suggestion that their love could never have been reconciled with the demands of their world. The Church's influence made even marital love fraught with tension. Husbands and wives were encouraged to see intimacy not as an act of passion, but as a duty for procreation. To seek pleasure for its own sake was condemned as lust, even within the sanctity of marriage. This teaching cast a cold shadow over relationships, turning what should have been tender into something monitored and restrained. Couples were warned against excess, against indulgence, against seeking joy in the very acts that bound them together. And yet, many ignored these strictures, choosing to find happiness where they could, proving that the human desire for closeness was stronger than doctrine alone. The paradox is clear. The more the Church tried to cage desire, the more it escaped into shadows, disguises, and stories. Lovers created secret codes, whispered vows, and exchanged tokens precisely because passion had been branded as sin. If love had been free, perhaps it would have been ordinary. But forbidden, it became extraordinary. Every boundary turned into a challenge, every warning into a temptation, every sin into a declaration that the heart could not be silenced. Medieval people lived with the knowledge that desire was dangerous, but instead of extinguishing it, they transformed it into something unforgettable. This tension also reshaped the idea of honor. For men, to control their passions was proof of virtue, a sign of knightly discipline and Christian piety. For women, to guard their chastity was to guard their entire family's reputation. In both cases, the weight of morality hung heavily over their choices, making even the smallest slip catastrophic. Yet the stories that survive, both in history and in legend, suggest that these boundaries were crossed constantly. Passion was too strong, too natural to be suppressed completely. The result was a society that publicly condemned love while privately consumed by it, a culture that lived in a state of permanent contradiction. The most haunting aspect of this paradox is that passion often felt more powerful precisely because it was sinful. To risk everything, status, family, salvation, for a single moment of closeness, made that moment burn with unbearable intensity. Lovers who dared to defy the rules were not simply choosing each other, they were choosing each other against the weight of their entire world. That act of defiance gave their stories the aura of legend, echoing through centuries as symbols of courage and tragedy. Even when they failed, their failures became immortal, proof that love could not be erased by sermons or laws. In the end, medieval romance was shaped not only by the longing of hearts, but by the fear of souls. Desire lived in the shadow of sin, and that shadow gave it its sharpest edge. The forbidden became irresistible, the guilty became holy in their defiance, and the fragile moments of passion became timeless because they were fought for against impossible odds. Love in the Middle Ages was not safe, not gentle, but dangerous and consuming, a fire that burned brighter, precisely because it was forbidden to burn at all. And this constant struggle between love and sin, passion and salvation, prepared the ground for the final understanding of medieval romance, that even in a world of contracts, supervision, and eternal judgment, the human heart refused to be silenced. It beat louder in the face of fear. It found secret paths through the darkness, and it turned even guilt into fuel. And in that refusal lay the very essence of medieval love, a love that could never be simple, but could never be forgotten.